Welcome back to the Deep Dive, folks. You know, we always love to push the boundaries here, explore those corners of knowledge that most people don't even realize exist.
It's true. We like to get our hands a little dusty, delve into those texts and traditions that have kind of, well, acquired a reputation, haven't they?
They have. And today, we're cracking open the occult archives. We're going
Yeah.
to be talking about books, but not just any books. We're
Mm.
talking about those volumes, those texts that are surrounded by this almost an aura, this sense of mystery, and even, dare I say, danger.
Yeah, those books that, throughout history people have whispered about, those that hold secrets, secrets that some have claimed are too potent, too powerful, perhaps even too dangerous to be read.
Exactly. And it's a fascinating area, isn't it? I mean, think about it.
Mm.
Mystical grimoires that promise, well, who knows what, or ancient religious texts steeped in rituals and beliefs that are, well, let's just say, outside the mainstream.
It's the forbidden knowledge, right? That's always been a draw for humanity. The things we're not supposed to know, the ideas that challenge the way we see the world.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're going to be focusing on one specific text, a text that's part of a larger work, actually. We're talking about The Fire of the Metals, Paracelsus, and the Seven Canons of Alchemy from Coelum Philosophorum.
Now, Paracelsus, he was a fascinating figure, a real Renaissance man in a way, a physician, a philosopher, and of course, an alchemist. Lived back in the 16th century, and he really shook things up, challenged a lot of the established scientific and philosophical ideas of his day.
He did. And his alchemical writings, especially this Fire of the Metals, have been influential, sure, but also often really, really misunderstood.
Oh, absolutely. People have projected all sorts of ideas onto his work, looking for easy answers, secret formulas, the philosopher's stone, that sort of thing.
Right. And let me be clear right off the bat, folks, we're not going to be teaching you how to turn lead into gold today, all right? But that would be pretty cool, wouldn't it?
It would indeed. But no, our focus is on the heart of Paracelsus's alchemical thinking, his ideas about metals and, what this whole idea of alchemy actually was about for him.
Exactly. So let's get into it. In Coelum Philosophorum, Paracelsus starts off by saying something kind of interesting. He notes that despite the long history of alchemy, despite all the teachings and writings, very few alchemists, very few, actually succeed in achieving the goals of alchemy, like, the big one, creating gold.
He does. And it's interesting how he approaches this. He doesn't blame nature, doesn't say that alchemy is flawed in itself. Nope. He puts the blame squarely on the alchemists.
On the alchemists, really?
Yeah. He says it's the unskillfulness of the operator, basically saying, hey, if you're not good at this, it's your fault, not the art's fault.
I see. So he's putting a lot of emphasis on the skill, the understanding of the alchemist.
He is. And he also talks about the matter, the materials being used. He says the quality and the amount can make a difference. So it's not just about skill, but also having the right stuff to work with.
Right, so the ingredients matter. Okay, so he's setting the stage here. And then he does something kind of unexpected. He says he's not going to repeat all the usual alchemical symbols and names and figures and all that stuff.
Yeah, he kind of throws that out the window, says it's just a pompous parade of words.
A pompous parade of words. I like that.
He's all about getting to the essence, the core principles of alchemy. And he claims that this new approach, this more streamlined approach, has led him to make some real discoveries, discoveries that even go beyond what the ancient philosophers knew.
And he emphasizes that these discoveries are based on actual experiments.
Yes, foolproof and experimentation, he says. So he's not just speculating here, he's grounding his ideas in observation and practice.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. He introduces this proverb, the proverb of the incredulous. And it goes like this: destruction perfects that which is good, for the good cannot appear on account of that which conceals it. What does that even mean?
It's a bit cryptic, right? But essentially he's saying that sometimes you have to break something down to reveal its true nature, to reveal the good that's hidden within it.
So it's like, to get to the gold, you have to remove the impurities, the dross.
Exactly. He uses the analogy of mountains concealing veins of metal, and then even the common metals themselves concealing the more refined properties of the others. So it's layers of concealment, and you have to peel them back to get to the heart of the matter.
And this ties into his central idea of the seven canons, right? Which are based on the seven common metals known at the time: gold, silver, mercury, tin, lead, copper, and iron.
It does. And fire, he says, plays a crucial role in this process of destruction and purification. The imperfect metals, those being mercury, tin, lead, copper, and iron, they're broken down by fire. While the perfect metals, gold and silver, they endure. They're refined by the fire.
Okay, so Listener, you ready for this? We're going to dive into these 7 canons one by one and see what secrets they hold. And remember, Paracelsus himself warned that these are not easy concepts to grasp.
He did. He said, an inferior intelligence does not easily perceive occult and abstruse subjects. So prepare to engage your minds, folks.
All right, let's do this. So the first canon, this is all about Mercury. And Paracelsus doesn't hold back, does he? He describes Mercury as this kind of, well, primordial substance, the corporeal vessel that holds everything in a concealed state.
He does, and he calls it a living and corporeal spirit, which is an interesting way to describe a metal, wouldn't you say?
It is. So he's attributing a kind of life force, a spirit, to Mercury. And he says its liquid form is unlike anything else, not caused by normal fire, and it can't be frozen naturally.
Yeah, he's really emphasizing its uniqueness, its special nature. And then he goes on to say that any metal can be generated from Mercury through the action of fire, with Vulcan, the god of the forge, as the mediator.
So Mercury is like the source, the seed from which all other metals spring forth.
That's the idea. And he does acknowledge that Mercury itself, in its pure form, is imperfect as a metal. And why? Because it can't fully solidify. It lacks coagulation, as he puts it.
Right. And he says that all metals are essentially Mercury up to a certain point in their development. He even uses gold as an example, saying that it was once mercurial but lost that nature through coagulation.
Exactly. It's like Mercury is the starting point, and the other metals are different stages of its evolution, so to speak. And he says that all the essences and arcanas, those are like the hidden properties and powers of the other 6 metals, are contained within Mercury.
So it's like a concentrated essence, a blueprint for all the other metals.
That's a good way to put it. And then he gets even more specific, talking about different types of Mercury, like a fixed Mercury of Earth and one that comes from the daily constellation.
Daily constellation. Now he's bringing in the stars.
He is. And he also mentions special Mercury associated with different substances like copper and arsenic. So there's this whole, almost a hierarchy of Mercury, different forms and variations.
Okay. And I can't help but notice he makes a clear distinction between Mercury and Quicksilver. He says Mercury is dead while Quicksilver is living. Now, what's he getting at there?
Yeah, that's a bit of alchemical jargon. It's likely about the difference between the spirit and the body, the subtle and the gross. Quicksilver, with its fluidity, its movement, that represents the living spirit. Dead, Mercury is more like the fixed, material form.
Ah, I see. So there's this duality within Mercury itself.
Exactly. And then he brings back this idea of quintessence, which we've talked about before. It's about the concentrated essence, the purest form of something. He's saying that true value lies in the virtue, the potency, not just the quantity.
So it's like reducing something down to its most powerful form.
Precisely. And that ties into his whole approach to alchemy, which is all about extracting and refining the essential qualities of substances.
Okay, let's move on to the second canon. And now we're talking about Jupiter. And in alchemical terms, Jupiter represents tin.
It does. And Paracelsus says that Jupiter is a manifest body, meaning it's visible, tangible, but he says it conceals the other 6 metals spiritually.
Spiritually, so it's a different kind of concealment than with Mercury.
Yes. Jupiter is like the outward form, the shell, that holds the spiritual essences of the other metals within it, hidden from view. And he says that Jupiter itself is composed of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, not the quintessence.
Okay, so it's more of an earthly metal, not as ethereal as Mercury.
That's right. And he notes that it melts with moderate heat and solidifies with moderate cold. So again, a kind of balance, a middle ground.
And he mentions Jupiter's affinity for the liquefied states of other metals, saying that things of similar nature unite more easily.
Yes. And then he uses this analogy of, well, it's almost like social dynamics, talking about how we're drawn to things we consider superior and repelled by things we consider inferior.
So he's comparing that to the way metals interact with each other.
He is. He's saying that metals with similar natures will combine more readily, while those that are more different, more remote from each other, will have a weaker connection.
I see. So it's about their inherent properties, their affinities.
Exactly. And then he makes this really interesting observation. He says that the further Jupiter is from Mars and Venus, and the closer it is to Sol and Luna, the more goldness or silveriness it contains.
So its proximity to gold and silver somehow influences its inner nature.
That's the idea. And he sees the process of transmuting the imperfect metals into the perfect ones as a process of mixing and separating, what he calls permutation. He even says that Jupiter already contains a significant amount of gold and some silver.
Wow, so it's like it's already partially transmuted.
In a way, yes. And he even suggests that adding lead and silver to Jupiter can increase its silver content.
Okay, so we're starting to get into the specifics of alchemical transformations here.
We are, and it's fascinating to see how Paracelsus breaks down these processes, how he sees the metals interacting and influencing each other.
All right, let's keep going. The third canon. This one's all about Mars, which represents iron. And he says that the 6 occult metals, the hidden metals, have made Mars corporeal, basically given it a physical body.
They have. And in doing so, they've also reduced its efficacy and made it hard and heavy. It's like they've burdened it with physicality.
And while Mars becomes hard, the other metals retain their qualities of color, liquefaction, and nobility.
Right, they haven't been weighed down in the same way. And he uses this analogy of a common man becoming a king. Mars gains dominion, but it also becomes subject to the limitations that come with that position.
So there's a trade-off, a gain, and a loss.
Exactly. And he even warns about potential snares and suggests that the roles of the metals can shift, with Mars potentially assuming the role of king and Sol, Luna, and Saturn taking Mars's place.
So it's a dynamic system. There's a constant interplay between the metals.
Absolutely. It's not a static hierarchy. Things can change and evolve within the alchemical process.
Okay, on to Venus. This is the 4th canon, and Venus, of course, represents copper. He explains that the other 6 metals have made Venus into an external body, giving it its color and its ability to liquefy.
Yes. And this idea of external again refers to the visible, tangible properties of the metal. He uses the example of things being transformed by fire, like wood turning to ash, and metals regaining their malleability after being heated, to illustrate this idea of making the manifest hidden, and vice versa.
So it's about the cyclical nature of transformation.
It is, and then he gets into the origin of Venus, saying it's the first metal created by nature's archeus, the life force that drives creation.
Nature's archeus, that's a mouthful.
It is. But basically, it's Paracelsus's way of saying that nature has an inherent intelligence, a creative power that guides the formation of things.
And he says Venus is created from the 3 prime principles after certain impurities are removed. And he even specifies the colors that come from purified sulfur, mercury, and salt.
He does. It's like he's giving us the recipe for Venus. And it shows how he sees metals as having a specific lineage, a story of their creation that's rooted in the fundamental principles of nature.
Okay, let's move on to the 5th canon. This is all about Saturn, which represents lead. And here, he does something really interesting. He gives Saturn a voice.
He does. Saturn speaks, lamenting its fate, saying it's been cast out by the other 6 metals, given a corruptible body, unlike its spiritual brethren.
So Saturn is kind of the outcast, the black sheep of the metals.
In a way, yes. It's burdened with physicality, with mortality, but even within this seemingly base metal, Paracelsus sees hidden potential.
He does.
Oh, yes. Saturn says that fire destroys the other 6 metals, except for gold and silver, which are purified in Saturn's water. And by water here, he means its essential spirit, its inner essence.
So Saturn has this purifying power.
It does. And he describes Saturn's spirit as a water that softens rigid bodies and its physical form as inclined towards the earth, able to unite with what it receives. He even says that there's a stone of cold within Saturn, a water that can congeal the spirits of the other metals into the essence of the 7th, which is silver.
And that promotes the creation of gold in conjunction with silver.
Exactly. So Saturn, despite its outward appearance, plays a crucial role in the alchemical process.
And he mentions 2 types of antimony, black and white, and their affinities with Saturn and Jupiter. And then he drops this bomb. He says lead is essentially black mercury containing 4 hidden colors.
It's like he's saying that even within the darkest, most base substance, there's a whole spectrum of potential hidden within it.
Wow. Okay, the 6th canon takes us to Luna, which is silver. And he makes this bold statement. Transmuting lead or iron into silver is just as difficult as transmuting any of the other 5 imperfect metals into silver.
He does. And he emphasizes this idea of moving from imperfection to perfection, not the other way around. It's a one-way process of refinement and elevation.
And he defines silver as the 7th, external corporeal metal, the one that contains the 6 spiritual metals within it. And conversely, the 6 spiritual metals contain silver in their essence.
Right. So there's this interconnectedness, this mirroring between the physical and spiritual realms of the metals.
And he differentiates between physical mixtures, where each metal retains its individual nature, and spiritual mixtures, where true transformation can occur.
Yes. He says that spiritual separation, what alchemists called mortification, is impossible without physical bodies as a foundation. So the physical is essential for spiritual transformation.
And he talks about this transposition of metals, moving them from a lesser state of perfection to a greater one, ultimately culminating in silver and then gold.
Exactly. And he reiterates that the six metals always generate a seventh, which is silver. And then he gets into the composition of silver itself, saying it arises from the 12 virtues of the six spiritual metals, which are linked to the 7 planets and the 12 zodiacal signs.
So he's bringing in astrology here, the influence of the celestial bodies.
He is. And he details how silver derives specific properties from each planet and sign combination. For instance, its liquidity and white color come from Mercury and the signs of Aquarius and Pisces, its firmness and fire from Jupiter and Sagittarius and Taurus, its hardness and clear sound from Mars and Cancer and Aries and so on.
Wow, it's a whole system of correspondences.
It is, and he concludes by describing the process of refining the metallic spirits through mortification, both by the miner and the alchemist. This leads to a more perfect physical form, one that is ultimately united and incorruptible, except for gold and silver in their initial states.
So it's a journey of purification, of removing impurities and elevating the inherent virtues of the metals.
Exactly. It's about bringing them closer to their ideal state, which is represented by gold and silver.
And finally, we arrive at the 7th canon, the culmination of it all, the canon of Sol, which represents gold. And he describes it as the corporeal 7th metal, the one that follows the 6 spiritual metals, and he calls it pure fire.
It's the pinnacle, the perfection of the metallic realm in his system.
And he emphasizes its beauty, its brilliance, its clarity, its heaviness, its coldness, its homogeneous nature. He says it contains the coagulated essences of all the other metals.
It does. It's like the final synthesis, the embodiment of all the metallic virtues. And he notes that it can be liquefied by ordinary fire or by the spiritual equations of Mercury hidden within it.
So there's this natural affinity between Mercury and gold.
Yes. But then he says something interesting. He says that to solidify liquefied gold, you need the presence of the other 5 metals, where the principle of coldness resides.
Coldness. But he just described gold as pure fire.
It seems paradoxical, doesn't it? But that's alchemy for you, always playing with these opposites, these seemingly contradictory forces.
So gold needs the coldness of the other metals to become solid. And he says that's why it's so difficult to melt gold without intense heat, because of this inherent coldness.
Exactly. And he even says that Mercury's heat alone isn't enough to do it. Mercury's purpose is to flow, not to solidify.
So there's this interplay between heat and cold, fluidity and solidity, life and death even.
There is. And he describes gold's fire as pure yet hard, exhibiting the color of sulfur. And he lists the 5 cold metals, saying that each one contributes its specific virtue to gold. Cold for its body, fire for its color, dryness for its solidity, humidity for its weight, and brightness for its sound.
It's like gold embodies the perfected aspects of all the other metals.
It does. And he explains that gold can't be burned by ordinary fire because of its firmness. One fire can't consume another, he says. They would just augment each other.
Interesting. And he brings in the concept of celestial fire, saying that it's cold and congealed on Earth, which is why our fire can't overcome it.
The fascinating idea. And he concludes by describing the threefold essence of gold: celestial or dissolved, elementary or fluid, and metallic or corporeal.
So he's linking its origin, its elemental nature, and its physical manifestation.
He is. It's a beautiful synthesis of his alchemical understanding of gold.
Now, after these 7 canons, he has a section called Certain Treatises and Appendices Arising Out of the 7 Canons. And there's a lot packed in here, but let's touch on some of the key points. He starts off by saying, God and nature do nothing in vain.
That's a statement of principle. He's saying that there's purpose and meaning in everything that nature does, even if we don't always understand it.
Right. And he has a note on Mercurius Vivus, or living Mercury, where he talks about the symbolism of white and black, associating white with life and light, black with death and darkness. He also uses the analogy of a house and its inhabitant, the house being inanimate while the spirit within is alive, which further reinforces his distinction between dead Mercury and living Quicksilver.
It's a recurring theme for him, this idea of a vital essence that animates matter.
Then he gives a recipe for a tested liquefactive powder, which is interesting from a practical standpoint. And then he gets into this whole debate about the congelation of Mercury, arguing against the common alchemical practice of trying to solidify Mercury to make silver.
He says it's a waste of time, that it actually dissipates the gold and silver that's already present in Mercury. And he claims there's a more direct and simple way to transmute mercury into silver without congelation.
And he even suggests a quick method for creating both silver and gold from lead, mercury, and tin.
Yeah, he throws that out there, but it's likely not as easy as it sounds.
Probably not. And in a section called Concerning the Receipts of Alchemy, he lists all these alchemical vessels and instruments and materials, but then he dismisses them as mere encumbrances.
He says they actually hinder the creation of gold and silver, and he insists that the true art is not learned through these external tools, but through understanding the principles outlined in the 7 canons.
So it's all about internal understanding, not external apparatus.
Exactly. And then he has this very cryptic section called The Art is This, where he gives this allegorical description of the alchemical process involving creating a heaven and placing planets on it and all sorts of strange imagery.
It's very symbolic, very open to interpretation.
It is. And it's likely intended for those who have already grasped the fundamental principles he's laid out, those who can decode the symbolism.
And then there's a section on how to conjure the crystal. But he clarifies that he doesn't mean magic here. He's talking about observing correctly, knowing, and understanding.
It's about the importance of clear perception and insightful interpretation of the natural world.
Right. And then he addresses this topic of concerning the heat of Mercury, where he argues against the common belief that Mercury is cold. He says it's actually very warm, which is why it's liquid.
And he describes a specific procedure for congealing mercury using a silver container and melted lead. He's getting into the technical details here.
He is. And he criticizes those who misunderstand Mercury's nature and reaffirms his central principle that perfect metals can only be created from metals, within metals, by metals, and with metals.
It's a key concept for him, this idea that you can't create something out of nothing, that transformation has to happen within the realm of the metals themselves.
And in a brief section, he lists the materials and instruments that are required in alchemy, and it's surprisingly simple. A foundry, bellows, tongs, hammers, cauldrons, jars, and cupels made of beech ashes.
Again, emphasizing simplicity, focusing on the essentials.
Then, in the method of seeking minerals, he acknowledges the challenges of finding ores, but suggests that divine providence can also grant knowledge of easier methods for creating gold and silver.
Interesting. So he's leaving open the possibility of a more spiritual path to alchemy.
He is. And he says that gold and silver can be more easily produced from certain metals, like mercury, lead, and tin, than from others, like iron and copper.
And he even mentions specific pairings for the creation of silver and pure gold.
He does. But interestingly, he downplays the importance of astrological influences in what he calls natural alchemy, emphasizing the skill of the alchemist instead.
That's a bit of a departure from the traditional view.
It is. And finally, he defines alchemy as the purposeful, intentional, and subtle endeavor to transmute the kinds of metals. He compares it to a lower heaven that separates the valuable from the worthless. And he encourages the study of alchemy, or spagyria as he calls it, as a way to discern truth from falsehood.
It's a path of knowledge, of self-transformation even.
It is. And he concludes by saying that metals are the most refined essence of common stones and should be sought, recognized, and extracted. And he emphasizes the influence of the celestial realm, the sky, in this process.
So he's tying everything together, the earthly and the celestial, the material and the spiritual.
He is. And it's a complex and fascinating vision of alchemy, one that's rooted in the natural world but also transcends it.
It's about transformation, about understanding the hidden forces that shape reality.
Absolutely. Well, folks, that's our deep dive into Paracelsus's Coelum Philosophorum. We've explored his 7 canons of the metals, his ideas about transmutation, his emphasis on the skill of the alchemist, and his unique view of the spiritual nature of matter.
And we've seen how he challenged the traditional views of alchemy, stripping away the elaborate rituals and focusing on the essential principles that govern the transformation of metals.
If you're intrigued by these ideas, and I know many of you are, I encourage you to dive deeper into Coelum Philosophorum and other alchemical texts. It's a rich and rewarding journey of discovery.
And who knows, you might even uncover some of those hidden secrets that Paracelsus hinted at.
You might indeed. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.